In 2014, US prosecutors described the case as one of the most serious national security breaches of the decade. The man at the center wasn't a spy, he wasn't a hacker, he was a small aviation trader living in Canada. When authorities detained him, he did not resist. By then, he understood exactly what he had been doing. When investigators searched his home, they didn't find ordinary business records. They found vast amounts of sensitive data accumulated over years, and within 2 years, he would be extradited, quietly sentenced, and removed from public view. His name was Su Bin, and this is the story of how he became one of the most damaging links in modern espionage. Su Bin did not enter this story through ideology or politics. He entered it through business. For years, he worked around the aviation industry, moving through the same international circuit that thousands of engineers and business people rely on. He attended air shows, technology expos, and industry fairs across different continents. These events were designed to showcase the latest innovations in the aviation industry. They also functioned as social spaces where people talked freely and carelessly. Aviation fairs are usually crowded and informal. Conversations happen over coffee, at hotel bars, even during dinners. People usually mention where they work, what they are building, and what is considered cutting edge. No documents need to be stolen when information is shared casually, one detail at a time. According to the US prosecutors, this environment is where Su Bin became valuable. You might be asking yourself, why would China need a guy who's attending aviation fairs, especially that he didn't possess any hacking skills? Well, the actual intrusion was done by hackers in China. These men were technically skilled, capable of breaking into corporate networks, and extracting large volume of data. What they lacked was context. They could steal files, but they didn't know which files mattered and which system were worth targeting. And this is where Su Bin came in. China didn't need him to hack, it needed him to interpret. Su operated in the aviation world, an industry built on layers of subcontractors, joint ventures, and overlapping responsibilities. He understood which companies fed into large defense programs, which engineers worked on sensitive components, and which projects were critical. At international aviation fairs, he moved comfortably through this ecosystem, listening more than speaking, and absorbing details that others dismissed as harmless. And to intelligence services, that made him unusually valuable. His role was to guide the hackers through specific targets. He identified which documents were the most important, which programs were failing behind, and where additional access might yield better results. China wasn't only looking to collect information, it wanted to accelerate its own aviation development by understanding where competitors were strongest and where they were vulnerable. Su's role was to help bridge the gap between raw data and strategic use, and that's why China chose him. He was the intersection between people, information, and companies. In modern espionage, that position mattered more than technical skills alone. Su did not lead the operation, he gave it direction. The hackers pulled data from the systems, and Su decided which data was worth it. Their targets were firms deeply embedded in the American defense system supply chain. And these were not always household names. Many were subcontractors, companies responsible for specific components, software systems, or testing process rather than the final product itself. Some of the companies were connected to advanced fighter jets, including contractors related to the F-35 itself. The value of the stolen data was highly practical. Hackers obtained technical documents, design details, and internal communications. That stolen data saved China 10 years of research and hundreds of billions of dollars. Instead of spending years trying to discover what works and what does not, they instantly learned where the limits are. And instead of repeating costly mistakes, they avoided them entirely. As China revealed the new fighter aircraft, analysts began noticing familiar features, and these similarities sparked a debate. Some argued that this similarity comes from stolen data, while others argued that modern fighters usually are similar in design. What matters is that access to sensitive data likely reduced uncertainty. It gave Chinese engineers visibility into how a rival system functioned, where it struggled, and how it achieved its performance. leaking. That alone was strategic advantage. And for US officials, this was the core concern. Subin helped transferring years of research and failure, and that was enough to make him valuable for one system and dangerous to another. For years, Subin attracted little attention from authorities. His name didn't appear in headlines or political debates. But investigations rarely begin with headlines. They begin with patterns. US officials started noticing repeated digital intrusions connected to sensitive aviation programs. Different attacks, different methods, but the same targets kept appearing. Over time, certain names started to surface repeatedly, not as attackers, but as intermediaries. And Subin was one of those names. His travel history, professional contacts, and communications began to draw attention. So the US government started monitoring him. His movements were tracked, and communications were analyzed. By early 2010, US authorities decided to start taking action. Subin was being viewed as someone playing a role in a broader effort to extract sensitive information. And once that conclusion was reached, the process accelerated. But the response itself was still deliberate. There was no public warning, no confrontation, only preparation. The arrest itself was procedural. Acting on a request from the United States, Canadian police stopped Subin while he was driving in British Columbia and took him into custody without incident. And from that moment on, the case stopped being purely legal and it became diplomatic. China quickly rejected the accusations, denying that Subin had acted on behalf of the state. Public statements were measured, but behind closed doors, diplomatic pressure followed. Messages were exchanged, objections were raised, and Canada found itself in a familiar position, balancing its legal obligations, its alliance with the United States, and its relationship with China. Subin contested extradition, and the legal process stretched for over 2 years. Throughout that time, something became increasingly evident. China did not publicly claim him. There was no sustained campaign to defend him, and no effort to elevate the case into a symbol or a cause. As months passed, the issue quietly lost urgency, and by 2016, Canada approved the extradition. Subin pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges related to the theft of sensitive military data. The admission was narrowed and controlled. The sentence that he received surprised many observers. Nearly 4 years in prison. For an espionage-related case, it was remarkably light. But the sentence was not an act of mercy from the US. By the time Subin stood in front of a US judge, the investigation no longer revolved around him alone. He was not the core of the operation. He was just a piece of it, and pieces can be negotiated with. Court documents made it clear that Subin cooperated. He provided information about how the operation worked, who was involved, and how information moved from stolen file to strategic use. In exchange, prosecutors did not treat him as a mastermind. They treated him as a facilitator, someone useful to bargain with, but not important enough to protect. And the reduced sentence reflected that calculation. Once Subin provided what he knew, his value diminished rapidly. After serving his sentence, he was deported. Today, his exact whereabouts are unknown. Most people never hear about cases like Subin's, and that is not an accident. These stories are not meant to inspire or raise uncomfortable questions. They are meant to send a message. So the next time a secret is revealed and the world argues over whether the leaker is a hero or a criminal, ask one simple question: who does the truth serve this time? This is the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any more ideas for me to cover in the next episodes, leave it in the comments. Until next time.